listener production. Hi, Sacha Barbour Gatt with you for this episode of The Briefing. Almost a year on from the October 7 attacks, the devastation, destruction and the death toll in the Middle East has only increased. Despite hopes of peace and a ceasefire, we seem further away from that reality than at any other point during these increased tensions. For the last week, Israel has been ramping up its attacks on southern Lebanon and Beirut, targeting militant group Hezbollah. More than 1,200 people have been killed, women, children and civilians among them, while up to 1 million people are displaced amid the conflict. Over the weekend, we saw thousands of people take to the streets of cities and towns across Australia to protest the loss of life in both Lebanon and Gaza, with a feeling of a new groundswell of support for the movement among Lebanese Australians. So what does it feel like to be Lebanese in Australia right now? Frustrating, scary, despairing, all of the above? Today I'm joined by Liz Deep-Jones. She's a journalist and human rights advocate, and she's also an Australian of Lebanese descent with family in the north of the country. And we're here today to hear her story. Liz, thanks so much for your time today. We do appreciate it. Look, as a Lebanese Australian, how are you feeling right now?
I'm distraught. I'm angry. I'm disappointed, extremely hurt and upset. I mean, these recent Israeli attacks on Lebanon, for me personally, are unwarranted. Lebanon is a sovereign country, and these attacks for me on civilians, they're horrific, and I just don't understand why the international community has stayed silent. I mean, 6 buildings in the Beirut region were completely flattened, and there were, hundreds and God knows how many thousands of civilians were there. So if this happened anywhere else, if this happened in Sydney, in Melbourne, any other major city, Western city around the world, the whole world would be calling Israel out. And I just can't understand why they've all stayed silent. I just can't come to terms with it. It's really upsetting.
Yeah, I can hear it in your voice how deeply it's affecting you. I want to ask, do you have family in Lebanon? And if so, have you managed to speak to them?
Yes, I do have family in Lebanon. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to contact them at the moment. So I'm hoping that no news is good news, that they're safe. We have, friends, relatives there. I do have a friend that managed to get out of there, and she's in the UAE, holding. She's staying there for a few weeks in the hope that she could go back. I've spoken to her. She's extremely distraught and also just in utter shock that the world hasn't stepped up and is trying to stop these outrageous attacks on civilians. So what's being done about it? Where are the sanctions? Where are the sanctions? And from our leaders as well, from Anthony Albanese, Penny Wong, I'm sorry, I'm concerned, or we're deeply concerned, is not enough.
What more would you like? When we saw Penny Wong at the UN over the weekend, and her comments have been fairly consistent since the outbreak of the war in Gaza, calling for a ceasefire, saying that the loss of innocent life is deplorable, but hasn't really gone much further than that. What would you like to see Penny Wong and the Australian government do?
Well, they need to call out Israel. They're committing crimes against a civilian population, and they must enable sanctions. This has got to stop. I just can't understand how these politicians and our so-called leaders sleep at night. How do they just say, we're deeply concerned, we're calling for a ceasefire? Call it out. It's got to stop.
Has the recent increase in strikes in Lebanon increased your feelings of solidarity with the people of Gaza?
I've always had solidarity with human beings who are being attacked. It doesn't really change anything for me. I think that what's been happening in Gaza, which we've all been watching since October 7, which, let me say, October 7 was horrific. And I do not support Hamas. I do not support what they did. But this is disproportionate. I mean, any person, any human being, I can't understand how they could not be upset and disappointed by what's happening. It doesn't matter if you're Lebanese, if you're Palestinian, if you're whatever nationality. It's about human beings. It's about humankind. I mean, this has got to stop. I don't care what your religion is. I don't care where you're from. But to just blatantly continue starving people, the Palestinians, their human rights are not respected. This is just crazy. It's unheard of.
Over the weekend in Australia, we saw protests across a lot of the capital cities, Sydney, Melbourne, as well as a few smaller towns around the country. Did you manage to get to any of the protests over the weekend? And if so, what was the mood like?
I was supposed to go to this protest. Unfortunately, I've got an inflamed hip. So I was at the bus stop and I was just had trouble walking, so I couldn't get there. But I was supposed to meet my brother and sister and some nephews, and also some friends were also there. And my friends are from various backgrounds. They're not from Arabic backgrounds, but they're supportive of human rights and supportive of a ceasefire. And they said that it was a peaceful protest. They were all together in solidarity. And it was just really basically for calling for a ceasefire and also for sanctions on Israel so that they cannot continue committing these war crimes on civilians.
These protests over the weekend are some of the biggest we've seen in quite a while. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think people are fed up. They're fed up with seeing these indiscriminate attacks on innocent civilians. It's unwarranted. What happened to following international law and going through a peace process? I mean, we are watching every day on our social media innocent people in tents in Gaza being slaughtered by constant bombing, and their women and children, their families, their innocent people just trying to survive. And I think that this has brought the whole world together. I mean, even the reporting on what is happening, there is no balance. The narrative coming from the media is skewed against people that are supporting human rights, people that are supporting a ceasefire. Why is that such a bad thing? This is about having compassion for your fellow human beings. It's as simple as that.
We saw some criticism come from certain commentators after the weekend's events because there were flags flying the Hezbollah symbol and, criticism that, these are registered and known world terrorist groups. Do you think having those sort of flags and those sort of supporters within crowds of peaceful marches dilutes the message and makes people think about something different when the message, as you said, is, we need to protest against the loss of innocent life?
Look, that's an explosive question. All I can say is I can speak on my own behalf is that I'm not a supporter of Hamas or Hezbollah. But for me, what Israel is doing, they're committing terror. And I think we live in a country where we must respect freedom of speech. So I think what the politicians should be focusing on is calling on sanctions and calling on a ceasefire.
But do you not see how it does dilute the message when there are flags flying at these events of registered terrorist groups?
I don't know. Look, I don't, like I said, I don't agree with the terrorist groups. I don't think it dilutes the messaging. That's their issue. Look, that's not for me to solve. I'm in support of human rights. I don't believe in promoting terrorist groups, no. But what Israel is doing is likened to a terrorist group.
I guess the thing that some people might find hard to reconcile is the idea that looking at Gaza with the attack launched by Hamas, I suppose people would say, well, that was an offensive action and then Israel has responded. Civilians getting caught up in something like that is completely abhorrent and we should speak out against it. But what other option does Israel have if it's being targeted by these terrorist organisations?
Well, look, I'm not an expert. What happened on October 7 was absolutely horrific. But, I mean, now we're nearly a year into this. I mean, what more does Israel want? I mean, they just recently killed the head of Hezbollah. They claimed that they killed another 20 militants as well. I mean, how many more people have to die? What is their end game? I don't understand it. I just can't understand how anyone, any human being with any sort of compassion can be offended by someone calling for a ceasefire or even wearing a keffiyeh. I mean, there is nothing wrong with that. It's in support of human rights.
Liz, do you think the general population here in Australia can truly comprehend what is going on in the Middle East? And when I say the general population, I mean people like myself who don't have family in the Middle East, who has no connection aside from what I witness coming through the news or on my social media feed. Do you think people like me can truly understand and comprehend the level of death and destruction that is happening?
Sacha, I don't think any of us can really truly understand. We're not in a war zone. I've never, ever been in a war zone, so I don't even understand it. I just have compassion for fellow human beings. And yes, I have family in Lebanon, but even before that, I was extremely distraught at what was happening. October 7, I was distraught. I was crying. I have family of Jewish follow the Jewish religion. And I have friends also that are living in Israel. So I also feel for them. It's very difficult for them. They're terrified. It's about human kindness. It's about compassion. It's about, having love for our fellow human beings. And that's how I see it. Look at what the poor people in Gaza have been going through. And what they've been living through is just absolutely horrendous. And what I want to know is, the so-called leaders of our planet, what are they doing? I mean, why is this not being stopped? And what is the agenda from the US, the United States, of funding and arming Israel? Why do they continue to do this? So you really have to wonder, what's the agenda and what is Israel and the US's long game?
What would you hope everyday Australians could keep in mind as they observe what is happening in the Middle East going forward?
I think what they need to do is put themselves in the shoes of the people living in Israel or the people living in Gaza, the people living in Lebanon. How would you feel if someone was attacking your home? How would you feel if someone actually walked up to your front door and said, you have to get out, this is my home now? Just like that.
Liz Deep-Jones, you have shared very much from the heart today, and we really do appreciate it. Thank you for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks, Sacha. Thanks for having me.
Journalist and human rights advocate Liz Deep-Jones there. And that is all for this episode of The Briefing. Thanks so much for listening. Remember, if you want to keep up with our other content, we are on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. And a really big way you can help us keep doing what we do here at The Briefing is by sharing eps that you enjoy or that you really got something out of with your friends, your family, your workmates, your dog, if your dog has a podcast account, anyone who'll have a listen. We really appreciate your help. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. with the headlines and another deep dive. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.